Did you know there are 5 countries that will attack China if they invade the Philippines? Who are these allies and why they would step in? We'll be looking at 5 countries that might, just might, ride to the Philippines' rescue. But first, hit that subscribe button because we are almost at 1,000 subscribers. First up, we've got the United States, a country whose relationship with the Philippines is about as straightforward as a game of Twister. They were colonizers, then liberators, then reluctant allies, and now, well, it's complicated. The US and the Philippines have this little thing called the Mutual Defense Treaty, signed back in 1951. It basically says that an attack on one is an attack on both. Except the treaty is vague, it doesn't specify what kind of attack would trigger this joint defense pact. A stern talking to by a Chinese warship? Nobody really knows. The US has been making noises about supporting the Philippines' claims in the South China Sea, even sending warships to flex their nautical muscles. But whether those muscles would actually be used to defend the Philippines? That's the million-dollar question. So, while the treaty exists, whether they'd actually put boots on the ground for the Philippines remains to be seen. Next up we have Japan, a country that knows a thing or two about being a regional powerhouse. Japan's got history with China, not always the good kind. And while they might be economic BFFs now, there's still that lingering tension. Japan relies on those shipping lanes like a teenager relies on Wi-Fi. Cut it off, and things get ugly, fast. Plus, they've got their own territorial disputes with China. Japan's been stepping up its military cooperation, providing patrol boats and training. They've even revised their pacifist constitution, which is a bigger deal than finding a parking spot right in front of the grocery store. But would they actually fight for the Philippines? It's a tough one. Japan's still wary of getting dragged into a conflict, and they'd much rather use their economic clout than their military might. But hey, if push comes to shove, maybe having a friend with a really big metaphorical sword isn't such a bad thing. Let's hop on down to Australia, the cool older sibling the Philippines never had. They're laid back, love a good barbecue, and will throw a punch for their mates. Australia and the Philippines share a bond over values and regional security. Australia's worried about China's assertive behavior. They've been beefing up their military and signing defense pacts. But would they go to bat for the Philippines? They'd consult on their response. Consult could mean anything from a letter to deploying troops. Australia's response depends on the situation and allies like the US. One thing's for sure, you don't want to face an angry Aussie. Now, let's turn our attention to South Korea, a country that knows a thing or two about living next door to a volatile neighbor. They've got their own complicated history with China, and while they're major trading partners, there's always that undercurrent of tension. South Korea and the Philippines might seem like an odd couple at first glance, but they've been quietly building up their defense ties, like 2 colleagues who bond over their shared disdain for the office printer. They've conducted joint military exercises, shared intelligence, and even discussed the possibility of South Korea selling warships to the Philippines. But would South Korea actually risk its own neck for the Philippines? That's the million-dollar question. South Korea's got a lot to lose if China gets too aggressive in the region, but it also relies heavily on China economically. So, while South Korea's support for the Philippines is growing, whether they'd actually commit to a fight is still up in the air. It's a situation that requires careful diplomacy and strategic ambiguity. Finally, we come to India, a country that's like the intriguing new kid in school, full of potential, a little mysterious, and with a knack for shaking things up. India's been quietly building up its military might. India and the Philippines might seem like an unlikely pair, separated by geography and cultural differences, but they've been warming up to each other lately. They both have territorial disputes with China, and they both see China's growing influence as a potential threat. So, they've been increasing their defense cooperation, conducting joint naval exercises, and even discussing the possibility of India selling the Philippines supersonic missiles. But would India actually risk a confrontation with China over the Philippines? That's the million-rupee question. India's got its own plate full of problems, from border disputes to economic challenges. So, while India's support for the Philippines is still developing, it's a relationship worth watching closely. So, there you have it, folks. 5 countries that might, just might, come to the Philippines' aid if China decides to throw its weight around. But as we've seen, it's a complicated picture filled with ifs, buts, and maybes. There are treaties, yes, but those are only as good as the paper they're printed on. There are shared interests and concerns, but those don't always translate into concrete action. Ultimately, the future of the Philippines, and indeed the entire region, hangs in the balance. It's a delicate dance of diplomacy, military posturing, and hoping for the best. But if you want to know more, if the USA could really help the Philippines, click here on the left side of the screen. But if you want to see a what-if scenario of a war between Philippines and China, click the right side of the screen.